Hi, everyone. This is Stuart from Sequart Organization. I'm the managing editor and bookline manager of our publishing line. I'm here today with Julian Darius, CEO and founder of Sequart Organization. And sorry for any technical difficulties getting this Kickstarter started up. There was some stuff on my end and Julian's end that prevent us from starting on time. But we're here now, and I would like to introduce Julian, and we'll be talking about his book on Jack Kirby, the weirdest sci-fi comic ever made, understanding Jack Kirby's 2001: A Space Odyssey. So this comic is an interesting comic. I've never got a chance to read it, but I've been able to read Julian's book on it, and a lot of questions come to mind. For instance, why would Jack Kirby adapt this very serious, almost Citizen Kane level sci-fi story? And because we all know who Jack Kirby is, he's very bombastic, he's very in your face and very colorful and explosive with his imagery. It's very overwhelming reading anything that Jack Kirby does. So why would Jack Kirby adapt something very meditative and thought-provoking? So I guess we could start off the conversation today, Julian, by asking sort of what was Jack Kirby thinking when he adapted this? Why would he adapt something like this when everyone's so familiar with his very kind of explosive imagery?
Well, I like that the first question is what was Jack Kirby thinking? Because in a very real way, that is where I started in the book, and that's really where the introduction starts with this kind of question of 2001 being so very meditative and thoughtful. You know, it's based on the Arthur C. Clarke novel. Actually, Clarke and Kubrick were writing the movie at the same time, so it's really a collaboration between them. And you know, it's filled with very thoughtful elements. So that was really the question of, you know, how do you get, if you thought anyone was going to adapt and then continue 2001, I don't think you'd ever think, let's assign Kirby to it. So, you know, this is a very strange question. And when you see the Kirby's 2001 adaptation, you certainly see his bombastic tendencies. But one of the things that's very interesting in that adaptation is that Kirby is an excellent visual storyteller. And so there are sequences that you think, oh, you know, this is emphasizing the wrong thing, or it's, you know, a little too bombastic. But there are other sequences that you think, oh, you know, Kirby nails this. And Kirby is doing something here that is different from the movie, but is just as good and adapting it successfully for the comics form. So there are things in that adaptation, like the transition that's very famous from the bone that's tossed by the apes by early on into the space station. And the idea is that these are both tools. Once you have people using tools, you fast forward, you know, a certain number of thousands of years, and you get space stations, right? In the comic, it's very hard to do that transition, and Kirby tries it, and it doesn't really come off very well because really that's a cinematic transition, and it doesn't, you know, just having another panel with a space station doesn't really do it. But then there are other things that Kirby does very well. So I think you're right to point to this difference of style. Why would Kirby do this is kind of a open question.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you consider cinema as a visual medium that's sort of invested with sound, and sound is really what emphasizes the passage of time. I know Douglas Wolk's idea is that the panel and the dialogue work together to emphasize the amount of time that's passing in between two images, two static images that are represented on the comic panel page. So when you have a very visually, aurally meditative work in the cinematic format and then try to capture that into a comic, it's a little bit jarring because there's always a like a musical adaptation to a film, like a musical version of The Wizard of Oz, and there's not too much of a disjointedness between the two properties, because even though they might be two artistic genres or two artistic forms that are entirely different from each other, they still sort of have this harmoniousness because they're united by visual aesthetic and sound aesthetics. And like you said, when you go into a comic, now you're working with static images. So I guess what I'm kind of curious to know is, you're mentioning certain scenes where Kirby really made something work when he was dealing with these static images. And I guess I want to know, what other examples do you have in your book that you talk about where you have Kirby taking something out of the movie and then really nailing it in the comic form?
Well, I remember some of the space station sequences. Kirby does very well. And one of the advantages of comics is that panels can be of different sizes, obviously. So you're right that comics don't have sound. They do have text, which, is an advantage. Movies can put or inner titles, but comics are better at text and word balloons and can put thought balloons in if they want. But really, one of the biggest advantages of comics visually is that panels can be whatever size you want. So in movies, you're limited to that movie screen. And it's true that a movie could, in theory, only use part of that screen. A movie could decide, okay, this scene is going to play better with a square image and just crop everything to the side. But most movies do not do that, and usually what we see in cinema is a constant progression in which all of the images are of the exact same aspect ratio, the exact same size. So in comics, because you could change panel size, Kirby is able to, like, for example, on that space station, which is so visual already, right? It's so geometric. The sort of famous sequence in which the astronauts are walking and they continue to walk and they're walking around the sort of cylindrical main sleeping area. Kirby is able to render that in a more squarish aspect ratio that lets you emphasize the height of that sequence. Now, if you think about that sequence in the movie, it's wide, so you can see to the sides of this main cylindrical vertical area. But that main area is actually vertical. So Kirby actually has a majority vertical panel in which you're able to see up and down in that cylinder and not emphasize those two sides. So that's a very simple thing, but it's really strikes to the heart of the difference between movies and comics. Kirby's also, as you said, very bombastic, and he's able to sort of convey motion very well. I mean, that's certainly one of Kirby's strengths. So that's another thing that Kirby brings. I think that vertical sequence in the ship, where you're able to see really what is more interesting than the movie shows you in a single frame, is just one of those successful adaptations.
I see. Now, it's interesting because Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick were writing 2001: A Space Odyssey simultaneously. So you have two creative minds, two very autorial creative minds coming together on one project. But Kirby, when he was doing 2001: A Space Odyssey, his adaptation grabs a lot from the Kubrick version, but also still retains some Arthur C. Clarke dialogue. So, is there any ways that Jack Kirby marries the two together where he's taking something that was a final product primarily of Kubrick's design, but now he's making it his own, if that makes sense? How do these three creative minds that are all very top creators in their own respective fields. Kirby's very well respected, Arthur C. Clarke, very well respected, and Kubrick has this massive filmmaking legacy that just continues to this day. So, how do you see these three mega personalities, these three mega creators, kind of interacting all in the same panel spacing?
Well, I don't know that there's any evidence that Kirby ever read Clarke's novel. I've read Clarke's novel. I grew up reading, not only Clarke's novel, but the sequels. And I don't see any evidence that stuff from Clarke is in there that wasn't in the movie. The movie is very much a adaptation of Kubrick's film. So I don't see a lot of Clarke influence, but I do think that you're right. There are three absolutely three different media, right? Novels, movies, and comics. You couldn't ask for bigger names in all three. And that was something that very much interested me about the project. And one of the ways that Clarke comes in there is looking at Kirby's continuation of the story versus Clarke's, because Kirby is doing this in the 70s when there is no sequel book yet, right? 2010 has not come out yet. So the only continuation of the story is Kirby's, and Kirby can just go crazy and do basically whatever he wants. And what he wants to do is very Jack Kirby. It has, Clarke's. It definitely is a continuation of the movie. But what I think is so fascinating is that it continues these aspects of the movie that Kirby finds interesting, or that you would think are very Kirby ideas to continue, right? So when Arthur C. Clarke is continuing the story, what he's interested in is the evolution of humanity. He in 2010 is dealing with the Americans and the Soviets responding to what has happened in 2001, and sending somebody else out to meet up with Hal and the ship, the Discovery. And he winds up kind of dealing in the further sequel books with, an incident on Europa, and then with the ultimate fate of humanity. So, maybe Clarke doesn't go as much into the sort of like Star Baby thing at the end of 2001, but he's very much sort of writing sort of classic sci-fi novels that are focused on society and ships flying through outer space and politics and all this stuff. Kirby doesn't care about politics. Kirby, the closest Kirby came probably to addressing politics was like in the Hunger Dogs. Kirby just, he doesn't do this kind of thing. He's not gonna, he's not gonna write, 40 pages that are set on a spaceship in which basically only conversations happen. So Kirby, as he does the continuation, it's interesting, like, for the first half of his continuation, he is basically continuing the setup, the idea of you start a story early on, and, in the past, and then characters encounter the monolith, and then you jump forward into the future, and you tell a future story with, right? So That's kind of Kirby's formula for the series at first. So, you have, Kirby doing Barbarian comics, and just totally ahistorical um, nonsense from a historical perspective, in which, it's just very bombastic, and then, you know, uh, it does not seem to fit in a 2001 comic. Characters are fighting and they encounter a monolith which has some influence on the events. And then there's a smash cut, or the comics equivalent of a smash cut, to some characters in the future who are on, again, have nothing to do with 2001, right? So you'll smash cut to like the future, and here are these astronauts who look just like the characters in the Barbarian comic, and they're on an asteroid, and there's an alien civilization in ruins on the asteroid, and and you're thinking, what? There's nothing like this in 2001, right? The solar system is not littered with ruins of various alien civilizations, right? That is like a DC Marvel bizarre comics convention, right? That does not fit in 2001. But it's almost like, and then aliens attack, and it's a different alien, it's like, 2001 is so controlled in what it's about, right? I mean, there's one alien species that is ridiculously advanced, and so much of the point of 2001 is we would not be able to understand that alien species. We don't know what they look like. They would be so far advanced that we would not even be able to understand them. They were only able to communicate in metaphors that are experienced by Dave Bowman as hallucinations. He's hallucinating a French style, I think it's Louis XIV's, formal room. And it's like, what do the aliens think this is a metaphor for? Is this supposed to put him at peace? I mean, they're pulling this out of his head, but they don't really know what these signifiers signify. And it's definitely something deep. It's about life and death and all this stuff, but it's not easy for them to communicate in a way humans can understand. And then you have Kirby's version, which is like, the solar system is filled with ruins of various aliens. They're all different alien races. The aliens are still around and interacting with these very Kirby-esque astronauts. And another thing that doesn't make sense is that in 2001, the launching of the Discovery and sending it to Jupiter, in the novel it's Saturn, but it's Jupiter in the Kirby comic too, is a big deal. And the idea of launching a simple spacecraft is a big deal. And half of why that movie succeeds is in a very Gravity way, like what people liked about Gravity, the depiction of, hey, space is difficult, right? Manned missions through space are going to be difficult, and we're going to explore that difficulty. It's not like Star Trek where, you have a liftoff sequence, and then you push a button, or Star Wars where, Chewie, get us out of here, you press a button and now you're flying, and the next thing you know, you're, at Alderaan or whatever. This is hard science fiction in which spaceflight is tough. And Gravity does that, 2001 does that, most serious sci-fi does that. Kirby doesn't do that. I mean, Kirby is just got people exploring asteroids, and there's no sense of this was tough to get there, and has colonies in space, and, whatever, because that's kind of how you do it in comics. And it seems clear that Kirby did not understand some of what we understand of 2001, or he didn't care. I think there's a lot of indication that Kirby just did not care, and he was interested in other stuff, and other stuff in the story. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I think that really auteurs, creative people, it's kind of their job to continue what they find interesting. It's not their job to continue all aspects of a previous story. It's their job to find what interests them and continue that, or extrapolate on that. And I think Kirby does that, and the best way you could frame it is, I mean, I guess the uncharitable way is he doesn't understand anything about 2001, right? That we think matters. But a more charitable version would be, he's just so confident in what he is doing and what he is interested in that he's like, hey, I'm definitely continuing this Star Baby thing. I'm definitely continuing the monolith. I'm definitely continuing this story set, history spanning idea of stories set in the past, and also stories set in a futuristic sci-fi setting. That's a pretty cool idea. And if you think that that is one of the appeals of 2001, that it spans human history and can explore these different settings and isn't bound by a single time, Kirby loves that idea. Kirby's like, hey, I'll give you a story. Here's a barbarian story, and here's a sci-fi story in one comic. That's awesome. And I think that's great. I think it's cool how confident Kirby was in his own vision.
What do you think about Kirby? So you were saying that Kirby envisions this massive expanse of human history, sort of this replaying and retelling of certain events over the course of human time. And it's interesting because a lot of other comic book artists and writers have sort of latched onto this aspect of Kirby, because Kirby will have in his Fourth World cosmology, for instance, where he'll have a cowboy, is one of the Forever People, and then one of Darkseid's minions is this guy from the 17th century wearing this Elizabethan England kind of clothing and fencing stuff. And so I've always been curious to see whether or not, I feel like Kirby has this awareness of of wonder, and this awareness of the otherworldly aspects of just life in general. Kirby cares about things that are, cares about things that are larger than life and these massive ideas. And so I see Jack Kirby in 2001 looking at Stanley Kubrick's conception of humanity as this ever-changing, ever-growing entity that sort of, there's this primal essence that runs through the course of human history, and then you're looking towards this end result of where humanity will be. Jack Kirby's take on it seems to be, there is this primal stream that runs through that runs through history, this strand of continuity, and but there's a wonder of it. It just keeps growing and keeps expanding. And so I can kind of see where 2001, Kubrick's idea of 2001 and Jack Kirby's 2001, they kind of meet together in this continuity of primalness, that it's all this wondrous journey where things keep getting bigger and bigger, and we're losing our grasp of controlling it and figuring it out.
Yeah, that is some amazing spiel there. I don't know how much I agree with it. I think that essentially, why do you have this sort of, a cowboy and the Forever People, right? Because Kirby thought it was cool to draw, okay? Because Kirby thought it looked cool, and why not, right? One of the things that people love about Kirby is how uncensored he is, right? And by that I don't mean, he, has, Superman participate in a gangbang or something, but I don't mean adult content, but I mean that he just does not censor himself as a creator. He's, hey, it'd be cool to have a cowboy here. It'd be cool to have, this sort of like Elizabethan outfit, just throw it in, right? Would Apocalypse, really be a place that had an evil axe as a serious weapon? No. but I'm not going to think about that. I'm not going to stop to think about that because an axe is cool. So, screw you, right? I mean, Kirby is such a visual thinker. I don't think that he was interested in those ideas. He was interested, especially as he got older, especially in his 70s work, which includes 2001, but especially in New Gods, in some philosophical ideas, okay? But Kirby was not a philosopher. I mean, Kirby was not a serious thinker. Kirby was not an academic. I mean, he does not understand. He also doesn't understand one of the key things about 2001, which is creative control, right? So here you have a man whose entire aesthetic is based on, I want to do a cowboy, so fuck it, throw it in, which is awesome. And I love those kinds of comics, right? I mean, that's great. It's wild. But it is the exact opposite of what hard sci-fi is all about, which is, and what serious literature is all about. And serious is kind of in scare quotes there, but certainly literary work is all about control. Why don't you have, aliens drop by in The Great Gatsby? I mean, maybe there was a day where F. Scott Fitzgerald was just like, I'm getting bored writing yet another scene about how great Gatsby is, and the West Egg. Fuck it, man! I'm just gonna throw those Martians from War of the Worlds in here, But Kirby would do that. I mean, Kirby was the guy who would think that and go, yeah, fuck it, let's do it, right? But F. Scott Fitzgerald was not going to do that. I mean, the whole point of what we admire about literature is control of genre, control of characters, consistency of characters, consistency of theme. We look for a single theme to be worked out subtly, balanced throughout a work so that it has a thematic whole. That's something that, Kirby never quite mastered. So Kirby is uniquely not only, again, sort of not the guy to do 2001, but I don't know that Kirby is really exploring these philosophical ideas. I don't know that Kirby ever really did that. I think he did explore them, but I don't think he explored them like a philosopher would do, or, like the comics writers of the 80s tried to do, where you have the British invasion of sort of Alan Moore and Grant Morrison and Neil Gaiman and Jamie Delano, and they're trying to, Peter Milligan, and they're trying to, I shouldn't speak for all of them as a single whole, but they're trying to bring that literary sophistication to one degree or another into comic books. That was not something Kirby was a part of. Kirby was interested in more cinematic ideas and bombastic ideas, but I think you're confusing, sort of Kirby's themes, themes of like oppression and throwing in a cowboy with having a deep sweep of history, the way maybe Sandman does,
Nice.
I think for Kirby it's just a cowboy's cool. I think for Kirby it's like, hey, this framework of 2001 lets me do a barbarian story and a kind of like Buck Rogers story in the same comic. That's awesome, But I think what's interesting is after the fourth issue, Kirby has a single issue that is an issue focused on the Star Child, which, is the star baby at the end of 2001 that, people have debated its meaning. It's very clear that it represents sort of the next stage of human evolution, which is very, you can't really present that to a audience of modern day humans who have not evolved to that point, right? So it's represented as a kind of new birth, a renaissance in which you picture a star baby. Now, is that a literal star baby? Is that a metaphorical image? Is that, what Dave Bowman sees as he's dying? Is that what he becomes? but it's metaphorical. I mean, for Kirby, no, that's just a superhero that is a baby. Like for Kirby, he's like, dude, that's the star baby, and the aliens are creating these star babies, and this isn't the first one. And so I'm going to do a story of a star baby like flying to another planet and kind of Star Trek style, seeing this other planet and trying to help it and reach out to it. And that's a cool story. I don't know that it really has anything to do with 2001's spirit, but it is a continuation of the story. And I think that it's very Kirby to look at that Star Child and say, hey, let's do a story starring a Star Child. That's wild. And in a way, that's something that Arthur C. Clarke, wisely never attempted, because he knew that, when he does the sequels, they're very focused on the humans. You've got to keep those aliens ambiguous, or, it doesn't work because, again, you can't fundamentally depict this more advanced, more evolved intelligence in a way that is going to be satisfactory and in a way that is going to be intelligible to us as, basically we are ants compared to them as humans. How do you tell an ant what it's like to be a human? So that's just not something that's going to work very well. And Clarke kind of does it, but he wisely takes a step back and focuses on the humans. Kirby doesn't seem to have that instinct that holds him back, that says, wait a minute, this is a bad literary idea. Like the danger author, Kirby does not have that instinct that says, danger, this is likely to fail. Kirby seems to just say, well, I'm bored doing stories about a story set in the past that continues in the future. This is getting formulaic. Let's do a one-issue story in which I follow the Star Child. And he doesn't restrain himself. And, I don't know that it's true to the spirit of 2001 as we see it now, but it's a legitimate attempt to continue it. I don't think it's illegitimate at all. I think it's fascinating.
I kind of see Jack Kirby as almost like the Michael Bay of comic books, except just much more, poignant, I guess more poignant than Michael Bay. But you actually brought up something that's interesting that I wanted to ask you about. So Jack Kirby's this very sort of visually driven science fiction author, writer, artist, and everything. And in the 70s, sort of as DC and Marvel, these two mega comic book entities, start sort of gravitating towards more corporate awareness. Like, it's not really a bullpen anymore. It's a corporate office where people write in cubicles as opposed in open spaces, that kind of thing. Is there any aspect of 2001, Kirby's 2001, where he's kind of phoning it in, or sort of integrating a lot of these tropes of corporate comic booking into this high science fiction property? Or is there sort of a respect that he has for the property? Like, he's doing this not because he's getting paid, a paycheck for it, but he's doing it because he feels some kind of affinity with this other science fiction property and this other science fiction writer and creator.
I don't know. I find that I find Kirby very hard to place in that kind of continuum, because Kirby is concerned with expressionism. He expresses himself. He makes it as dramatic as possible. Kirby could make a character walking across a room dramatic. He would shoot it from a weird perspective and get the extreme foreshortening in, and a character would be saying I've got to get my keys. Kirby could do that, and he was amazing at that. but I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, there's material that Kirby loved, but Kirby also knew it was a paycheck, and Kirby was not an auteur in the sense of, like he went to DC in the '70s and was able to create the Fourth World and Jack Kirby's Demon and Commandy and I love that stuff. And I think probably, if anything expresses Kirby as an auteur, it's that stuff, especially the Fourth World. But he wasn't supported, even though DC put Jack Kirby is here on all of their comics. I mean, that was a huge thing. It was like, hey, motherfucking Jack Kirby is at DC now, right? That was a huge deal, and yet. Yeah, no. I mean, because by then Marvel had trumped DC, and that was a huge coup. We got Jack Kirby. He made you guys. He's the number one guy, and now he's here.
You can see just how much I'm all about DC over here in this business. So that was a good time for all of us when Jack Kirby was able to finally give Marvel the finger and create one of the coolest science fiction cosmogonies.
Yeah, but I mean, Kirby was very unhappy, obviously, at Marvel. He did not get fair credit as co-creator of basically the Marvel universe. Except for Spider-Man, Kirby basically co-created all of the stuff that's being made into movies now, and all of the stuff that, except for Captain America, because that started in the '40s, Kirby co-created all of that, and Kirby also felt that he didn't get credit for basically co-writing stuff. That Stan Lee would say, okay, so this big alien comes to New York, Dr. Doom comes back, he's got this device. I mean, Kirby would have a very sketchy plot, and he would go and draw the whole thing, which really involves writing. And, in some sense, an artist is always a writer in comics because, they're getting a script, and even if they're getting full script, they're choosing to what they depict, right? And, you can imagine a continuum in which you have sort of like Alan Moore style, very full script on one side, and sort of Marvel style, basic description on the other side. And I'm getting a bit of an echo here, but in between, you've got, say, somebody says, give me a few panels in which, Captain America charges across the room and then tackles the villain, right? And that's a whole page. And a writer doesn't necessarily have to break that down into panels. A writer doesn't necessarily have to indicate page breaks. Artists are always having some level of writing. But under the Marvel method, Jack Kirby was, in a very real way, not just coming up with the look of the characters, but writing, these comics. And he did not get credit for that. And so he was definitely pissed off. He was not happy with the corporate environment at Marvel, but he ended up not being happy with it at DC either. And, DC gave him some freedom, but DC also ended up canceling all those titles. Most of them didn't last all that long. And you look at the Fourth World, and it seems staggering now that DC would cancel them all except for Mr. Miracle. Which, and the idea that you'd continue Mr. Miracle, it's kind of like, Kirby was telling this story with all these different titles, is kind of working in loose unity, and DC says, yeah, just continue that one, forget these others. I mean, you just can't continue the structure in that same way. And Kirby was willing to do it, right? I mean, for Kirby put up with a lot, and he obviously drew multiple comics a month and worked his butt off his entire life. And that's really admirable. and there's no denying that he got screwed over. But I was going to say that after that Star Baby issue, boy, I don't know that Kirby ever phones it in, right? I mean, because he doesn't take a step back and think, okay, I'm going to take a month or two and think about what this next issue is going to be, right? I mean, that's not he doesn't have time for that. I mean, Kirby's producing multiple comics a month, and again, he's not really a philosopher. He's not trying to put together the most carefully considered literary issue he can. That doesn't exist really back then, but it definitely is not in Kirby's wheelhouse. So, he plows forward, and I don't know that, I don't know that it's fair to say he phones anything in, because it's clear that he delivers, and he delivers in a dramatic fashion. At the same time, you could say that he's not taking the time he needs to figure out some of these stories. So I don't know that it's fair to say Kirby phones it in, because he's producing great art. But go ahead. I do want to get to these later issues of the series.
Yeah, well, that was what I was kind of curious about, is that Kirby had a lot of experience, sort of, as you say, kind of filling in the gaps that Stan Lee would provide him. So in 2001, is there any evidence that Jack Kirby is really digging into this 2001: A Space Odyssey property from a narrative perspective, as far as captions go? Because captions is sort of the captions sort of tear down the subtlety of 2001: A Space Odyssey, because now he's like telling you, like, this is how this character feels, or this is what's going on, or this is what's on this person's mind, or something like that. So how does Jack Kirby's use of dialogue emphasize or de-emphasize the subtlety of 2001: Space Odyssey? Does it help in later issues as he sort of reaches the climax of the story, or does it sort of take away from, maybe if he had just erased a dialogue swath, like a swath of dialogue would have made the comic significantly better, or something like that?
I mean, I think back to the adaptation that Kirby did of the actual movie, which was printed as a Treasury edition. So it was in, super big format, larger than comic size. That was kind of a fad in the 70s.
Like this, like that. The 17.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an example. And I think those are awesome. I have some of those, and there have been experiments since then, like with the Paul Dini and Alex Ross collaborations. There was the JLA Heaven's Ladder that was like that, and there have been a few other examples. Okay, you're showing the Paul Dini, Alex Ross, but that is not actually a Treasury edition. That is the trade paperback right. So, so there have been a few examples of that format. I think it's an awesome format. But at the end of that adaptation, Kirby is adapting the Star Child sequence. And Kirby fills it with captions, right? Now, how can you adapt that sequence, which is really a long visual sequence? And I'm talking about not only what happens to Bowman, but also, the sort of warp-like effect that goes on for some time at the end of 2001. It's very trippy, it's very psychedelic. How do you adapt that to comics? Well, you kind of have to use captions. And those captions inevitably spell out things that are intended to remain ambiguous in the Kubrick version. So that's an example of kind of Kirby spelling it out, and to some degree Kirby is spelling it out in a way that is Kirby's own interpretation of 2001, which unsurprisingly tends to be a lot more literal than I think most of our interpretation of that film and that ending. So that's an example of kind of where not just Kirby's literalism, but also the requirements of the comic's form which kind of require captions at that point, kind of limit the ambiguity or what you can do. Of course, comics have other benefits that Kirby explores. As far as the later issues, the continuation, again, you're kind of presuming that Kirby is exploring themes from 2001. I mean, he is, but he's continuing the plot. And I think what's interesting is he's continuing things that he finds interesting about the plot. So he's continuing like the further adventures of the Star Child, right? Which is just bizarre to think about. He's giving us other instances that the monolith interacted with human history, right? So again, that's not really what 2001 is about. I mean, in 2001, there are a very small number of monuments, and there's no real evidence that they have intervened in human history outside of implicitly spurring human evolution, right? And we don't know what they did that for. We kind of assume they did that to help us, to grow another species that would evolve into, not just sentience, but evolve to go into the stars and take its place as a starfaring species. We kind of assume that, but there's definitely no indication that like the monolith is this device that is like wandering through human history, changing events, right? And that again is a case of kind of literary control, right? You might, as a writer, have an instinct to write something like that, but you know that once that monolith is like controlling human history too much, humans lose their independence, right? I mean, this is the problem with aliens kind of building the pyramids and all that nonsense, right? Kirby doesn't do that, but the problem with those stories is, what did we do, right? I mean, if all of our history is just, the series of bizarre interventions, we lose our independence, and then what is the point of us taking our place in the stars? Now, Kirby, interestingly, doesn't go for those key historical moments. He goes for these weird, because he wants to do like a kind of medieval story, barbarian story, and so he's not really interested in these historical moments. He's interested in kind of genre moments. So I think it's interesting, that's totally legitimate. I mean, you could continue 2001 and say, hey, we're going to have the monolith intervene over and over again, right? Or multiple monoliths. It's the idea of the monolith intervening in human history that is cool, and we're going to have it intervening time and time again, and we're going to juxtapose sequences set in the past with, sci-fi sequences. And we're just not going to have the same sense of literary control. I mean, that is continuing aspects of 2001. But it's almost like Kirby misses everything in the middle of 2001, which is, the moon sequence, the discovery, all of the stuff with the HAL computer. That's not stuff that Kirby initially has any interest in continuing at all. And that's basically all the stuff that Arthur C. Clarke had interest in continuing. So they couldn't be more different. Now, in the later issues, once you hit issue 6, Kirby, you were talking about this corporate reaction. Kirby, all of a sudden, I think issues, 5 and 6 are by far, I'm sorry, 6 and 7 are by far the, I think it's 5 and 6. But anyway, the two ones that begin in the future. At this point, Kirby breaks what he's doing and breaks the formula of the series dramatically.
Ah, there we are.
Hey there.
Hey.
Can you see me there?
Yes, I can see you just fine. I was just finishing my my recitation of the third act of Hamlet to my. I didn't. I'm lying. I was actually talking to them sort of about these prestigious large formats and how it's actually interesting how narrative heavy a lot of these are, just because the expanded amount of space sort of facilitates more narrative, more dialogue, and how sort of the absolute editions, such as like the Sandman absolute editions, are more conducive to having these narrative heavy stories because there's just more visual space for you to kind of absorb in the story.
Yeah, we should bring back those treasury editions, man.
Yeah, they're really great. I also apologize profusely to our Sequart Patreon members for the delay, and so sorry if you, well, you did. You're all watching this right now. Sorry about that you had to endure that. So, anyways, we're kind of coming up on the end of our time here. However, I was curious.
Well, I did want to. I mean, if we can just extend the episode a little more.
Yeah.
I feel like I should address, the later issues, because we haven't really gotten to those.
Okay.
And, I'm not sure where I cut out there talking about them. But, I think that, there's this 2-episode, 2-issue sequence that happens once Kirby abandons the formula, that begins with a bombastic superhero comic. And then you discover that this is all a simulation in the future, and that the future of 2001, right, fast forward like 100 years and, 200 years, and that future is obsessed with superheroes. Now, that does not really make sense from where 2001 left off, but you can see how that would be a fad. And in this story, Kirby makes fun of superhero fans, and is satirizing this kind of corporate superhero culture in which people want to live out these fantasies, but they want them to be very formulaic. And it's, Kirby is producing this very quickly to deadline, but they're really beautiful issues. They almost have like these French sci-fi elements. There's a beautiful page in which this main character, after his superhero simulation, is at a beach, and you realize, kind of like Truman Show style, much like the Truman Show, this is all also a simulation, and this beautiful backdrop is just a backdrop, and it's very Truman Show. It's almost it's probably as Philip K. Dick as Kirby ever got, and it's beautifully done. It's fantastically done. It's really well written, and the issue goes on, and eventually the monolith comes in, and you get a little more typical adventure. But even that is a better kind of sci-fi adventure, and I think that while maybe not 2001, it certainly reaches these heights of both satirizing that corporate superhero culture, Kirby making fun of his readers in a way. You could say that this is Kirby in the 70s, very dissatisfied with kind of how his career has gone, and placing some of the blame not just on, Marvel editorial, but also on readers who kind of want the same thing over and over. And I think that hasn't been explored nearly enough. And then, ironically, the last 3 issues are Machine Man, which introduced Machine Man, who's, part of the Marvel universe now. And Kirby, it kind of starts as a 2001 story, and the monolith is briefly in there, but by the end of it, it's just a superhero story. And basically the series continues as Machine Man #1, which is in the Marvel universe. So in this real way, like 2001 ends and basically transitions to a very much more formulaic Marvel title. That's a superhero title. And all those superhero-y aspects that were kind of implicit from the beginning of the series, by the end of the series, have taken over. And it literally transforms into a different superhero title. But there's this interesting kind of way station along the way in which Kirby formally brings those superhero elements in and makes fun of them and offers a kind of social satire of comics fans and especially superhero fans that I think is not just a brilliant story, it's actually, you know, pretty literary and successful visually and pretty advanced stuff, but also has this whole aspect of social satire and kind of making fun of where comics fans were at in the 70s. I don't think it's been looked at nearly enough. It might not really belong in a 2001 comic, but it's some brilliant, successful stuff.
Do you feel that something like Grant Morrison's Muscle or Flex Mentallo might be a contemporary equivalent of what Kirby was doing in the 70s?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that, you know, Grant is not really interested in making fun of his fans, you know? I mean, and Grant loves superheroes, right? I mean, I think that actually those two issues, you could argue that they're far more revisionist. There's a sense of bitterness to them. You know, they're probably, you know, Kirby did not usually bring his bitterness out. You know, the Hunger Dogs, there's some bitterness in there. You know, the end of Fourth World, there's some bitterness in there. But usually Kirby's stories are not especially cynical and you know, bitter. And this story, it doesn't come off as cynical, but it definitely comes off as if Kirby is really making fun of, you know, his fans, but more accurately, sort of the audience that wants, you know, endless formulaic superhero stories and does not really want, you know, Kirby isn't a auteur who's interested in those kinds of literary flourishes, although he has them in the story, and I think that's fascinating. I mean, Kirby could do that. But, and I think that's part of why this story works so much for me. But Kirby also was unsatisfied with, you know, when he did stuff that was more out there and wild, and maybe it was uncontrolled, but it was him as auteur doing weird stuff and non-superhero stuff. You know, the more, the less formulaic it was, the less it sold. And, you know, really Kirby struggled with that his whole life. I mean, you know, in the 70s, he wanted to do stuff like The Demon and, you know, and Kirby's Fourth World. And, yeah, that stuff today seems to hew pretty closely to the superhero norms. But at the time, it was a big departure from, like, the villain of the week model, you know? And, you know, and audiences didn't necessarily embrace it the way Kirby wanted. And Kirby never really got the artistic freedom he wanted. And maybe that artistic freedom would not have produced the kind of literary stories that we got in the 80s and that really moved comics forward. But, you know, they may have been very visionary and visually brilliant comics that did carry comics forward into a more auteur era. And Kirby wanted that. He wanted that freedom. And to the extent that he got it, those experiments were not tremendously successful. And I think, you know, between that and his experience with everybody ripping him off, he must have had a lot of bitterness.
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of sad in a way that this is Kirby's really only self-aware moment in his career, and it comes out as him sort of lashing out against the people that have sort of robbed him of his artistic kind of integrity, of just having to constantly produce the same thing over and over again. And actually it brings to mind something
let me just interrupt to say, I don't know that it's Kirby's only self-aware moment, But I think one of the things that's interesting is it's not hateful. It's not really mean. But the people who he's satirizing are his readers. He's satirizing the kind of people who you might have seen at, a signing or something, who, are saying, yeah, it's cool that you're doing this sci-fi stuff, or it's cool that you're doing like Commandy or whatever, but, have you ever, wanted to go back to, Doctor Doom, or, who would win in a fight, and they want more of the same. And there's a kind of unthinking, I just want the superhero formula, the standard superhero formula in that audience that kind of, if anything, it prefigures not Flex Mentallo, but some of the arguments that we've had recently, especially around gender and race, about kind of the ways in which the superhero audience is kind of reactionary and does not want change. And for Kirby, those changes were not about gender and race so much as just him being allowed to explore other genres and bend what those stories were supposed to be, as far as the audience thought was supposed to be. But there is that kind of reactionary aspect to superhero fandom, and it's that Kirby's railing against. But I interrupted you.
Well, what I was curious is that Arthur C. Clarke continued 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Jack Kirby did his own continuation of it. So I guess what I'm kind of wondering is that here's Arthur C. Clarke writing his own books about 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then he sees Jack Kirby probably before he starts, or at least before he finished 2010. But he's seeing Jack Kirby kind of seeing what he's doing and running with it. So, I mean, it's kind of...
we don't know that. I mean, Clarke, I don't know that Clarke ever read them. I mean, Clarke, you can't imagine, for example, Kubrick going, they licensed this shit to Marvel, and there are these pulpy, stupid comics being made about my movie. I mean, fuck the studio is probably what Kubrick would have thought. I don't think Kubrick would have read them seriously and thought, this Jack Kirby is an auteur. He's different than me, but I'll check it out. Kubrick was a control freak, much more than Jack Kirby, and Kubrick hated, the studio doing anything without his permission, and I think would have hated that these comics existed. Clarke, I don't know, would have read them.
Well, it's interesting to see two auteurs, Clarke and Kirby, kind of creating in parallel, and almost kind of it kind of prefigures almost the way that comics were eventually carried out as far as continuity and crossover is concerned, because you have one writer that follows one narrative strand, and then his title gets canceled, or at the very same time you have another writer writing technically in the same continuity, like maybe post Crisis on Infinite Earths. DC wants a certain route going in a certain direction that will eventually take us into the 90s form of comic booking, but then you have other probably more auteur-driven authors kind of taking their own vision of it. So is there sort of this dynamic in these two continuities between Jack Kirby's 2001, Arthur C. Clarke's, where I'm sure they weren't really aware of each other, but it still kind of shows this in vitro kind of picture of two authors sharing the same conceptual universe, but taking them in completely different directions.
I think that's very true. I think it reminds me of how today we have a lot of franchises and a lot of stories that get continued in this kind of forking paths way, where, for example, Superman Returns sort of ignores Superman 3 and 4. And so it's kind of like, okay, watch Superman 2, and then you can go in one of two directions, right? And there are a lot of franchises like this. There are a lot of novel series and TV series like for example, Terminator, right? The Terminator TV series says, "Fuck Terminator 3, we're continuing Terminator 2," and going in a totally different direction. And then the movie franchise, has no room for that TV series to ever exist. And so you have kind of like two parallel universes that fork after Terminator 2. And that's become increasingly common. So essentially, with 2001, you have this sort of forking paths thing in which 2001, really the movie, is continued by Kirby in comics, and it's continued in novels by Arthur C. Clarke. What's interesting about that is a couple things. One is that Clarke is continuing the movie too. Clarke, when he wrote the original novel, 2001, he wrote it in kind of collaboration with Kubrick, and Kubrick gets credit on it. But Arthur C. Clarke went in another direction in some places, and he's got it taking place. When he continues it with Jupiter. So he is doing a sequel to the movie, and really Arthur C. Clarke, there are a few other discontinuities between even his own novels that continued it, and Arthur C. Clarke kind of saw each novel as not necessarily occurring within a single universe in which all of these novels occurred, but rather occurring in slightly different universes in which he could kind of bracket the past work and continue what he wanted and take what he wanted and leave, make changes retroactively as he wanted.
It's interesting then, because then now you have this episodic structure where you have Arthur C. Clarke writing, these compacted narratives, and then you have Kirby writing in issues where it's the same thing but on a much smaller scale, where the narrative scope is smaller.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that the narrative scope is smaller, but the emphasis couldn't be more different. I mean, I think one thing that's really cool about this comic is that, it's strange to think that this was produced in the 70s. There was a re-release of 2001 back then, but there's no home video at the time. There is, but it's unbelievably expensive. I mean, people have projectors in their houses and buy prints and stuff. I mean, there aren't VCRs, and there definitely isn't download on demand, So, in this weird time, Kirby is kind of continuing this as a comic, and I think that when we think about classic sci-fi franchises, right, we think about Star Trek and Star Wars and, Battlestar Galactica, and sort of Star Wars started all of these, sci-fi franchises. Yet there is this movie that got a sequel in cinema. It got 3 sequel novels. Most people don't know about the sequel comic, which was produced first. But there was this moment in which you could kind of imagine a 2001 franchise. And I think that's really cool. Imagining a franchise built around this movie that is acknowledged to be such a masterpiece of cinema. We don't usually imagine, like Star Wars is really fun, but let's be serious, outside of really special effects.
Real. There's a focusing crystal built, and then it sends force energy through it, and then that force energy is bound into a saber form, and it's actually part of Jedi training.
Whatever, man. I mean, Star Wars is a kind of, masterpiece in a way. It was very influential, but I mean, it's not 2001. Okay, it's not a serious sci-fi movie. It's a cool movie. It's a fun movie. It changed cinema. It changed all of popular culture. But I mean, it does not have the artistic cachet, and for some very good reasons, that 2001 does. And I think that I love the idea of a franchise built around really artistic and literary ideas, and maybe it's got some Jack Kirby bombastic, episodes in there, and maybe it's got some stuff that is out of sync with the general tone. But hell, that's fine. And I just think it's awesome to imagine this point at which 2001 could have been a franchise. I mean, had the 2010 movie taken off, Marvel did an adaptation of it. Had that movie taken off, you could have imagined sequel movies. You could imagine, a TV series. I mean, Kubrick might have hated it, but it could have been done without him. And I think it's cool to imagine a 2001 franchise. And the comic is kind of a weird moment in time in which, that could have happened. It could have happened again after 2010 was released in cinemas. But it didn't get very good reviews. It didn't do nearly as well as 2001, certainly critically. So I think that's fascinating. I think it's cool imagining a 2001 franchise.
Imagine a world where fifth-dimensional aliens can push books off of bookshelves with gravity.
Yeah, well, that's Interstellar is a version of 2001 in a lot of ways. It's just that, not to ruin Interstellar, but I mean, Interstellar, imagine if those aliens are evolved humans. I mean, that's something that's been suggested by ufologists, which I don't believe, but, some believe that aliens are advanced humans traveling through time. And, imagine if those advanced humans of the monolith those aliens are really advanced humans, and mix in a little bit of the Forever War, and you basically get Interstellar, plus a little bit of the Earth is failing, we got to get out, which is true in 2001. We got to get off planet, although that's just for human evolution. That's not for reasons of a kind of dystopic Earth's ecology has collapsed. But yeah, you're right. I mean, imagine if, hey, look, man, I mean, how cool would it have been if this comic, for all of its faults, had succeeded? And maybe 2010 was a bigger hit, and we got more movies, and we got, maybe we got Grant Morrison doing, weird version of 2001 and a riff on it, and maybe Chris Nolan was brought in to kind of reboot the franchise, and Interstellar was a 2001 reboot officially in some kind of weird capacity. I mean, you could imagine that timeline.
I actually was just about to ask you which comic book writer you would have liked to take over the helm of continuing that 2001 franchise. And it's funny that you say Grant Morrison, because you can kind of see a 2001 connection with Seven Soldiers of Victory, where you have this gentry being these hyper evolved humans coming back in time to suck the life force out of Earth. But then you have this whole scene where you have a where is it? You have a whole scene. I can't find it.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
You have a whole scene where the first man, I forget his name, but he's a Kirby character, and this whole spread that J.H. Williams does using Kirby's art and using Kirby styled illustration of showing
Anthro?
Yeah, Anthro shows Anthro, this precursor of humanity.
No, that's the monolith. Yeah, totally.
So
I mean, Metron is the monolith. Yeah, totally. I mean, that's there in the beginning of Final Crisis too. I mean, Metron is the monolith, dude, and that's totally correct. That is totally what's going on there, and the 2001 influence is there. I think another thing Grant does really well is, Grant before Interstellar, 2 decades before Interstellar, was interested in kind of how fifth-dimensional beings, or more advanced a more advanced being, not necessarily a more advanced civilization, but kind of this fifth-dimensional mentality would look at us, right? That's something that always interested me, and so when I see it in Interstellar, it's like, yeah, there's so much in that movie that I've read about my whole life and never seen on film. And Grant, for Grant, that's also part of comics as a two-dimensional thing that reads as a kind of three-dimensional or four-dimensional experience. But Grant is very interested in that kind of stuff. And I could see Grant, more than anyone, doing some kind of version of what the aliens from 2001 are like, that is both kind of incomprehensible to us, which it has to be in the spirit of 2001 and be in the spirit of serious science fiction, but at the same time make it comprehensible to the reader by, you know, sort of making a fifth-dimensional mentality in four-dimensional space, so that if you are able to pull down one dimension, it's all entirely comprehensible. And you just have to kind of bracket things that bracket that you're pulling everything down a dimension, and now you can understand it fine. And so Grant is one of the best writers at depicting higher states of consciousness in a way that people can understand and get, and exploring some of the implications of that. So, I mean, you know, come on, man, how awesome would it be if, you know, there were like, a history of, good and bad, 2001 comics, whatever, that franchise winds up being called. And Grant comes in and does this, fifth dimensional riff on those Star Child beings, I mean, you definitely, I think you're right to point to that Anthro sequence. It's definitely 2001.
Yeah. We didn't receive any questions today from our viewers. However, I do have a question for you regarding 2001. My question is, who would win in a fight? I'm just kidding.
The Star Baby or Darkseid?
Dark. No,
but I mean, how cool would that have been if if 2001 continued at Marvel, and then maybe it continues with somebody else, and Jack Kirby does his Fourth World and whatever, and there's a DC Marvel crossover with the Star Baby and Darkseid, man, and there's a Star Baby who goes to Apocalypse and tries to elevate their civilization and help the Hunniker dogs. I mean, that's so awesome. I mean, it's so wrong from a 2001 is a masterpiece that you can't touch point of view. But I would love that comic to exist.
Oh, it'd be great. I mean, maybe the Star Baby is what started the first gods, and then the Star Baby species rifted, and then that became Apocalypse and New Genesis, and then there's these two worlds living in constant synergy, and they're trying to reconjoin. They're trying to come back together and become the Star Baby once again.
Well, I'd like to see Metron decide in the middle of this story, I've got to go to the planet of these aliens who created the monolith, and it's all bizarre, and only Metron can process it, and it's abstract and hard to render on the comics page, and that would be a trippy sequence.
So, all right. So I guess my question, a serious question, would be: do you see any cross contamination between Jack Kirby's 2001 and then Jack Kirby's work in the New Gods, the Fourth World cosmology? Do you see any kind of connection between the two, at least from a conceptual basis, where Jack Kirby is feeding energy from one or the other, and that sort of inspires one work, inspiring the other, and so on?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that, like I said, kind of Kirby takes 2001 and runs with it, and kind of does these kind of crazy, bombastic stories. You were pointing out, sort of the cowboy character and, and stuff like that. I think that at its best, the New Gods, which to me is the heart of the Fourth World, the what is it, New Gods 4, the Pact, which I think is so brilliant. I mean, that is really it's much more kind of Star Wars sort of sweeping saga stuff than it is sort of what we think of as 2001. It's sweeping sci-fi epic stuff. It's brilliant. I can't say enough good about it. I think that maybe they're connected in the sense of Kirby going crazy with a kind of sci-fi element, and I think that maybe they're connected in terms of Kirby being disillusioned by just creating formulaic superhero stories. Because really, the fourth world is superhero stuff. I mean, even the new gods are kind of sci-fi superheroes. But they're different. Look at the Pact. The idea of jumping back into the past and doing an episode set in the past that's, interrupting the main narrative, that's some brilliant stuff. That's stuff that, Starman did later, Sandman did later. It's much more bombastic than the way Sandman did it, but it's brilliant stuff. It's epic stuff, and you cannot say that it is formulaic superhero stuff. And the more Kirby got away from that, the more we love it, and we love it today. It didn't really sell at the time, or it didn't sell as well as DC wanted, but that is the stuff that we love today. The more Kirby was Kirby and let go of the formula and ran with it, the more we love it today. And it has stood the test of time. 2001 has kind of been forgotten. Maybe my book has helped it be rediscovered a bit. But, so I do see that kind of connection there. I do think that the sense of good and evil of New Genesis and Apocalypse representing, in a very superhero way, pure good and pure evil, is something that is kind of far into 2001. And there's no place in 2001 for that. Kirby definitely has that good and evil mentality that he brings to all of his stories. And I think that is something that is totally alien to, sort of Arthur C. Clarke's work. It's totally alien to Kubrick's work. It's totally alien to me. It's not the way I see the world, but it is a pulp convention, and it is a filter that Kirby brings to most of what he does. So that is something that is very different, on the other hand.
Interesting. Well,
we've gone long.
We've gone long, but hopefully, the technical difficulties, whether or not I find a way to edit them out, I hope that this has been a good time for you, our viewers, to get to know Julian's heart a little bit more and how much he loves Jack Kirby's 2001: Space Odyssey, but also to appreciate Jack Kirby himself, because I'm sure that Jack Kirby would be happy knowing that the work that he really cared about was the work that stood the longest beyond all of his au revoir or over, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oeuvre. Yeah. Oeuvre. You got to make that R-E, être. Oeuvre.
Oeuvre. Yeah.
It's very hard, yeah.
That this is what stuck. And that's really touching, just from a comic book enthusiast perspective, but also from a scholastic perspective, that it is the most innovative and interesting art that perseveres, and not the cookie cutter crap that Stan Lee was forcing Jack Kirby to write on a regular basis.
Well, Stan Lee was a master of his audience, and he knew what they wanted. It's not a slam against Stan, but I mean, Jack Kirby needed to grow and evolve, and unfortunately, in the industry at the time, he didn't have room to do that. And 2001, like a lot of Kirby's 70s work, is you're sort of watching Kirby strain against the system and try new things and get rebuffed again and again. And it's sad. But I do think that Kirby at his best I'm not as big a fan of sort of, the early 60s, Stan and Jack collaborations as a lot of comics people. I think most of it is unreadable, those early Fantastic Four issues. I mean, God, it's pretty awful going. The Galactus stuff is awesome. The cosmic stuff is awesome. And I think that, at its best, I mean, New Gods, the Fourth World is very uneven, but at its best, it's fantastic. I think Hunger Dogs is brilliant. And Kirby at his best, really stands alongside anyone as a writer and an artist. And if he had been around, if he had been, it's impossible to imagine him 10 years older than he was. Yeah. Because he was active in the golden age, it's impossible to kind of imagine him, sort of displace his career 10 years later. It would have been totally different. But if he had had the option, he tried doing independent comics in the 80s and they didn't do well. But if he had really been able to have the, to be able to do like a Vertigo title or, wow. Do Image Comics. Imagine Godland by Casey, and Scully, but done by Jack Kirby. I mean, in a very real sense, that's what Godland is. When you see this stuff, it's sort of the spirit of Kirby, imagining what Kirby might have done at Image. It's pretty trippy.
Yeah, it is. Kirby's has a profound impact on my life, somewhat inadvertently, because Bruce Timm was really inspired by Jack Kirby's art. So, in a way, I sort of had a contact of Jack Kirby before I even knew about Jack Kirby, because Bruce Timm pulled so much from his influence. But anyways, we're out of time. But I just wanted to thank you, Julian, for talking with me about Jack Kirby's 2001: A Space Odyssey and about your book explaining everything there is to know about the 2001: Space Odyssey. And I encourage all of you who see this, obviously our Sequart Patreon exclusive members will receive a free copy this month for being a part of the Patreon membership. However, once the rest of all of you see this, I encourage you to go out and to pick up Julian Darius's book on 2001: Space Odyssey. Again, that was the weirdest sci-fi comic ever made, understanding Jack Kirby's 2001: A Space Odyssey.
And that's a bombastic title. It was actually Mike Phillips who convinced me, to go with that title. I had another title, and Mike was like, the weirdest sci-fi comic ever made is so much better. And I was like, yeah, okay, you're right. And a few people have sort of said, I don't know that it's the weirdest ever. I think that it is pretty weird, imagining, this very controlled thing being done by Kirby. But how appropriate, there's some thunder here. The gods are playing the role of Jack Kirby here. But, how appropriate to Kirby's bombastic title that the book has this bombastic, weirdest sci-fi comic ever.
Yeah, and how appropriate that the thunder would go off, right, as you were saying the title of the book.
Well, I just want to thank the Patreon donors. You really keep Sequart going. It makes a big difference. And, if you're not a donor, you haven't pledged to Patreon, even, $1 a month, $5 a month. I mean, if everybody gave $1, I mean, Sequart would be in a totally different place and able to, hire new people and really expand and do more books and do more of this stuff. So thank you so much, Stuart, and thank you to all of our supporters.
Yes. Thanks for having me, Julian. Until next month, I am signing off.
All right, cheers.